The earth beneath Hyatt's leather boots had been stomped flat by the footfalls of tens of thousands of people. The quiet night air carried the sound of snoring from the tents of the highborns all across the tourney grounds. It was the first feast since the joust, and the thrill of the final tilt in the lists had brought every man, woman, and child into a frenzy of celebration. Hyatt had been able to witness the joust from a perspective he had never dreamed of. He could still see the powerful horses of the finalists beating the ground and the pile of broken lances in the dust. As Hyatt carried the wineskins back to his master's tent, he passed by the small pavilion which had housed the knights that changed his life forever. The occupants had changed, obviously, with the previous tenants unable to compete following their dishonorable acts. Hyatt slowed his pace and finally halted at the tent, taking in the green color, rendered dull in the pale moonlight, but brilliant in the sun, and the gold trimmings which adorned the edges like a crown. He recalled his encounter with the three knights that had taken up residence in that pavilion a week prior. He had been filling wineskins as he was tonight when he came upon the trio displaying their arms for the joust. Among the three was a pale man in purple regalia, sporting a roaring lion beneath a brilliant sun as his sigil. He was bragging to his companions about his lance, which he had reinforced with castle steel to prevent it from breaking. In hushed tones, he swore he would unseat the dragon bane in the coming joust. Hyatt could still hear the sound of his own voice on that night.
"That's forbidden by tourney rules,"
he had said, unsure of the source of his confidence to speak. As a boy of 8 and only the ward of a nobleman, he had no proper right to speak to the highborn knights so freely. He supposed his bravery was the result of his father's influence and the noble history of House Hardgrave from whence he came. Though his father had lost everything they had owned, he was fiercely loyal and proud of their noble ancestry. The cheating knight had risen from his seat with a dangerous look on his face.
"Then it's a good thing no one knows about it. Otherwise, I'd be in trouble."
His companions were not far behind him. Hyatt had backed away from their advance, but he tripped over an anchor rope from another pavilion and fallen flat on his backside. The wineskins he had been filling had tumbled into the dark dirt, one springing a leak in the process. Hyatt recalled scrambling to his feet and drawing his training sword. From that point, his memories were hazy. He had taken a beating from the three knights, certain he would die at their hands. As the boy pleaded for mercy, he remembered looking up in time to witness an unfamiliar knight step in and beat the three brutes back. He had moved in such a way Hyatt was certain it had been the warrior himself in silver armor. The knight had picked him up from the dirt and carried him to the tent of the tourney host himself. The noble lord had listened to Hyatt's story, and the knights in turn. Thanking the both of them, he had disappeared quickly, and the tent that had once belonged to the three knights had been empty within the hour. Hyatt was brought back to the present by the sound from a nearby tent. The animalistic grunting was something he had grown used to, but he still scowled in disgust and continued walking towards his master's tent. As he pulled aside the long fabric that enclosed the tent, he heard the soft sound of weeping from within. He hesitated, unsure of what to do, but the occupant had heard him begin to enter the tent and had ceased the noise. Awkwardly, Hyatt continued into the tent.
"I'm sorry to disturb you, my lord,"
he began, indicating the wineskins in his hand. His master sat on a small cot across the tent, still wearing his armor from the joust earlier that day. The silver plate was riddled with dust and flecked with blood, but the state of the man within was much worse. Lionel Redfield was the embodiment of sorrow. His ruddy, handsome face besmirched with mud and streaked with the stains of tears. He made no effort to hide his face from Hyatt, for the two had grown close over the weeks since he had rescued the young boy. Lionel pointed to the only table in the humble tent, upon which sat a lone candle, the only source of light for the pair.
"How many times do I need to remind you?"
Lionel asked, dropping his hands and returning his gaze to the floor.
"You needn't call me my lord when there's no one else about."
Sorry, sorry, Lionel.
Hyatt stuttered, placing the wineskins upon the table and turning to face his master.
Stop apologizing,
Lionel continued, his melancholy gaze fixed upon the ground.
You're of far more noble birth than I am, and I'm no more fit to make you my squire as a peasant.
Hyatt stood fixed near the table, watching the noble Lionel Redfield hang his head in despair. How could a man so honorable be so smitten by his past? Lionel had shared his entire life story with Hyatt in the week they had been companions. Lionel had been abandoned as a child, left on the streets to die and scarcely surviving starvation, war, and the elements. He had lied about his noble heritage to earn the right to fight in this tournament, but to Hyatt, he had earned that right many times over. Not only had Lionel rescued him from certain maiming at the hands of the cheating knights, but he had also won the tourney melee and the jousting competition. Only hours ago he had unseated Dickon Langhorn in the final tilt.
You're the most noble man I know,
Hyatt admitted. Though he had not met many knights in his 8 years of life, he spoke truthfully.
I killed a man today,
Lionel spat, fury rising against another storm of bitter tears. The knight's voice was shaking, and so were his gloved hands. Hyatt did not move, unsure of what his obligations were in this moment.
The healers say Sir Delmore will not die,
Hyatt offered, hoping the news would give Lionel some sense of relief. Instead, Lionel jumped to his feet. His whispering voice was pained and guilt-ridden.
I'm the one who poisoned him, Hyatt. I put that bloody vial in his water. I didn't even know what it would do to him.
Hyatt looked at his boots, unable to offer any more peaceful words. Lionel was distraught, he knew, and no amount of comforting would be able to ease his pain in this moment.
I'm going to Varric Uros to turn myself in,
he continued, beginning toward the opening of the tent. Hyatt suddenly found his voice once more.
You can't,
he exclaimed, moving to block the door from the imposing knight's advance.
You promised to take me with you across the sea with Varric Uros and make me a great knight.
Lionel hesitated, staring into the eyes of the poor boy. Hyatt could see the pain behind his eyes, the guilt and sorrow that ravaged him. He let out an exasperated sound and returned to the cot, where he sat down once more. Hyatt released the breath he had been holding and relaxed himself. In the days that followed, Hyatt saw Lionel become more and more silent. He knew the knight sought every bit of information about Edric Delmar he could possibly find, and Hyatt could often hear him returning to the tent late at night after sneaking around the noblemen's tents to hear the rumors they spread. On the eve of the final event at the grand tournament, Lionel sat in the tent, sharpening his sword with a whetstone as Hyatt scoured the mail and plate of his armor to restore its lost shine. Lionel was explaining to Hyatt the rules of the coming event.
Only 14 warriors have been selected to compete,
he was saying, the stone gliding along his blade, oil and water dripping from its path.
These 14 are divided into 2 teams of 7, each representing an avatar of the gods. Varric Uros has declared that the victorious team will accompany him on the adventure to conquer the lands beyond the narrow sea.
Hyatt had dreamed of the land, hearing stories and rumors of the barbarians that inhabited it. There was even a tale of a wild king wearing a bear's skin riding a dragon. This was certainly spoken in jest, but Hyatt suspected the nature of the stories were true, and he longed to see them for himself.
Will you be facing against Sir Delmar?
Hyatt asked softly, hoping the question wouldn't send Lionel into a tirade. Lionel hesitated, the soft stone resting on the blade of his sword. He sat for a moment, as if he could see something Hyatt could not in the atmosphere of the tent. Then, as suddenly as he had paused, he resumed his work.
The healers say he won't recover for another fortnight at least,
he said cordially, though Hyatt knew he was only masking his guilt beneath the facade.
The rumor is that Dickon Whitewood is turning the entire camp against me, though.
Hyatt had heard this news as well. Dickon was sour after the joust, disappointed he had lost in hand-to-hand combat against Lionel in spite of knocking him off his horse on the pair's 10th set of lances. Hyatt looked up at Lionel, stood quickly, an idea forming in his mind that he knew would solve every problem. He grunted, looking for the words to say.
Well, I've got to use the latrine.
It was all he could think of, and he flushed a brilliant red on his cheeks as he raced from the tent. Night had fallen quickly and quietly, and 2 pairs of boots patted the ground softly away from the tourney grounds. Through the winding streets of the vast city, the companions spoke only instructions to one another, and only in whispers. Behind them, the fading fires of the tourney pavilions became dull imprints of light, dotting the earth as stars dot the sky. At last, the pair stood upon the steps of the sept, the image of the warrior towering above them. Carved from stone and imposing 100 feet in the air, Hyatt pulled the hood of his cloak back to see the structure more clearly. The granite and marble building was protected by the carved knight, the pillar that was his sword thrust into the ground like a monolith of power. Dickon stood beside Hyatt, looking at the impressive figure.
You say the man's inside?
He asked, as if every fiber of his being was questioning why he had followed the boy here in the first place. Hyatt nodded his response, and the two made their way to the great stone door of the sept. Hyatt knocked twice and waited. Dickon looked around nervously, a strange sound making him particularly skeptical of the looming night above their heads. Moments passed with no response, and Dickon finally blurted out,
"Are you going to knock again?"
As if in anticipation of the question, the door gave a great thud and began to swing inward. Behind the door appeared a small septon, whose robes dragged along the marble floor of the beautiful interior hall. He did not speak to them, but he raised his arm to indicate them to enter. As they did, Hyatt could see 7 altars illuminated by thousands of candles, each lit to represent a prayer to the figure at whose feet they were placed. Dickon broke the peaceful silence harshly.
"Is this the bloke you told me about?"
He pointed to the small septon, as if in disbelief. Hyatt nodded, and Dickon made a noise of disbelief and exasperation. Turning to the septon, he spoke more nobly than he had previously done.
"I wish to be made a knight, good sir."
Candlelight danced across the deep wrinkles of the old man's face, and Hyatt could make out the faint hint of a grin before the man cracked a wide smile. His teeth were bent and blackened, and the manner of his smile made him look deranged. Hyatt had once seen a rat with a similar disposition in his father's castle. His father had killed the rat in that moment, and Hyatt somewhat wished his father was here to do the same to the septon. The old man spoke in a voice like whispered venom.
"Have you the coin?"
Dickon hesitated. Hyatt had not disclosed that part of the deal to him. As Dickon turned to Hyatt in anger, Hyatt had already begun to advance, digging deep into his tunic for the sack of gold coins. Speechless, Dickon could only watch as Hyatt handed the entire bag to the septon. Peering into the purse, the septon appeared satisfied and turned to walk toward the altar of the warrior. The ceremony was short. The old man said some words and bid Dickon kneel and repeat them. Hyatt stood back near the altar of the father, listening to the septon's voice, yet thinking about that of his father's. He wondered if he would ever hear that voice again, and if perhaps that voice could speak the same words Dickon was repeating in that moment. He had spent every last coin in his possession in order to buy a measure of peace. Dickon had agreed to withdraw from the final event in exchange for his knighthood, though it had taken him much more to convince him to spare Lionel in spite of what had happened in the joust. Hyatt was certain his recounting of the truth to Dickon had done very little, but now he was watching the man kneel before the warrior to take his vows.
"Rise, sir. What was your name, lad?"
The septon concluded.
"Dickon Langhorn,"
came the determined voice of the kneeling warrior.
"Then rise, Sir Dickon. One of the gods and all that."
The Septon turned away and trailed off, opening the coin purse Hyatt had given him and reaching his wrinkled fingers in to touch the soft metal. Dickon stood, turning to face Hyatt. He looked bolder, stronger, and confident.
"I'm finally a knight," he said, looking at his hands as if they held some sort of power now. "I'm finally a knight."